The Cowhands rigged a marriage to the homeliest maid in the county, for a laugh. The deed was in my coat pocket when Pete Rewell rode up beside me and said I was the luckiest man in the territory. He was grinning, the kind of grin a man wears when he knows something you don't, and he's been carrying it all morning like a coin he keeps flipping. I didn't answer him. I had 40 fence posts left to set before the ground froze hard, and I'd been thinking about nothing else since first light. I reached down for the next post, lifted it out of the wagon bed, and drove the iron bar into the dirt to make the pilot hole. Rewell was still sitting his horse, still grinning. He said the boys in the bunkhouse had drawn up papers, a marriage arrangement. Said they'd matched me to Edna Frick, who was the second daughter of Walt Frick over on the Broken Bow Creek Road, and who was known in a radius of maybe 15 miles as the homeliest unmarried woman in the county, and also as the sourest, and also as the one most likely to end her days alone with a yard full of chickens and an opinion about everything. He said they'd signed my name to a letter of intent, already sent it. The post went in, I tamped the dirt, I moved to the next mark. I could hear him behind me, waiting for me to go red in the face or start cursing or threaten to find the men who'd done it and settle the business. That was what they wanted. Rewell and Denny Cork and the 3 younger hands, they'd been pulling small meannesses on me all fall, ever since I'd turned down the foreman position Cartwright offered, which they took to mean I had no ambition and therefore no spine, and which made me a safe enough target for their entertainment. I said the next post. I thought about the situation as I worked, not with anger. Anger costs a man something, and I was 43 years old and I'd spent enough already. What I thought was, a letter of intent isn't a legal instrument. Walt Frick could throw it in his fire. His daughter had no obligation to receive me, let alone agree to anything. And if they'd already sent it, there was nothing to undo, so I might as well finish the fence line and ride in for supper. Rewell eventually got bored and rode off to report that I hadn't reacted, which would disappoint them. I set the rest of the posts. The thing that happened next was not what any of us expected, including me. 3 days later, I got a reply. It came through Cartwright's house because that was the address on the envelope they'd used, and Cartwright's wife brought it out to the yard herself and handed it to me with an expression on her face I could not fully read, somewhere between pity and amusement, leaning toward something else she was choosing not to show. The letter was from Edna Frick. Her handwriting was like fence wire, straight, angular, nothing wasted. She wrote that she had received the letter signed in my name, that she did not know whether I had sent it in earnest or whether it was someone's notion of a joke, and that in either case she had a proposal. She said she needed help. Her father was in poor health. The ranch was running short-handed. She had 2 brothers who had gone east and showed no interest in returning. She wrote, "I am not looking for sentiment. I am looking for a man who will work, who will not drink past what's decent, and who will not be cruel. If you are that man, come on a Sunday and we will talk. If this was a joke, burn this letter and no more need be said. I will not write again." I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket and went back to work. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not Cartwright, not the men in the bunkhouse. I let them spend the week looking for the blow-up that hadn't come, the anger I wasn't carrying, the embarrassment I hadn't shown. They started to get uneasy about it, which was more satisfying than anything I might have said. On Sunday morning, I put on a clean shirt and rode out to Broken Bow Creek. The Frick place was not prosperous, but it was kept. That was the first thing I saw. The fence along the road was tight and patched in the places it needed patching. The yard was raked. The barn doors were on their hinges. These were things a person did or didn't do, and they told you something about the person. Walt Frick met me on the porch. He was a man run thin by illness, sitting in a chair with a blanket across his legs, even though it wasn't that cold yet. He looked at me without any particular warmth and asked what I wanted. I said I was Elia's cord, and I'd come in reply to the letter his daughter had written. He studied me for a while. Then he said, "Go around the back, she's in the garden." I went around the back. She was pulling the last of the root vegetables, kneeling in the dirt with a canvas sack beside her, working methodically down a row of parsnips. She stood when she heard me coming, and she was taller than I'd expected, nearly my height, with wide shoulders and a face that was not what you'd call beautiful. But it was a face that looked like it had been through weather and had not been diminished by it. Pale blue eyes, a jaw that was set square. Her hands, when she pulled off the dirt-caked gloves, were red at the knuckles. She looked at me without smiling and said, "Which one are you?" I told her. She said, "Was it a joke?" I said, "I didn't send the letter, but I'm here, and that ought to answer the question." She looked at me a while longer. Then she said, "I'll put some coffee on." We sat at the kitchen table and she poured, and we talked for 2 hours without either of us performing anything. That was what struck me most, the absence of performance. She didn't try to seem more agreeable than she was. She told me flat that she had a temper, that she had strong opinions about how a place should be run, and that she had no patience for laziness or for men who talked a great deal and did very little. She said she didn't care about pretty words, and she had no use for a man who couldn't look her in the eye. I told her I wasn't much for pretty words either. She said she'd noticed. I told her about my situation, what I had, which wasn't much. A fair wage, some saved money, no land of my own, no family left to speak of. My wife had died 7 years ago, a fever, 2 weeks from start to finish. No children. I've been working other men's places ever since and getting good at it and owning nothing, which had started to bother me less than the not owning anything used to, and that in itself bothered me. She listened without interrupting. I asked what she wanted from an arrangement. She said someone to work beside, someone steady. She didn't say anything about love. She wasn't going to say anything about love, and I respected that more than I can explain. I said I'd think on it. She said, "Take all the time you need." She said it flat, not as a kindness, just as a fact. She wasn't going to chase me. I rode back to the Cartwright place in the cold and thought the whole way. What I thought about was not the arrangement itself. I'd made up my mind somewhere around the second cup of coffee, and I'd known it and hadn't said it because I wanted to sit with it a while and make sure it held. What I thought about was what it meant that I was considering it. I am not a man given to self-examination as a regular practice, but 43 miles of empty road in November will get you somewhere eventually. I thought about the 7 years since my wife died. Edna, her name was also Edna, which was a thing I kept to myself and would keep to myself. I thought about the way I'd organized my life since then, which was to make it need as few things as possible. A bedroll and a saddle, a fair wage, work that used me up enough that I slept. I'd been good at it, too good. I'd gotten so practiced at wanting nothing that I'd started to believe it, that the wanting had actually gone, rather than just gone quiet. This was what the Frick woman had put a dent in, sitting at her kitchen table talking plain. Not because she was going to save me or because she needed saving, but because she was real in a way I'd stopped expecting people to be, and her realness made me feel the shape of the hollow I'd been carrying and ignoring. I didn't like feeling it, but I thought I liked it better than not feeling it. I turned around 3 miles from the Cartwright place and rode back. She came to the door when I knocked, and she looked at me without surprise, which told me she'd expected I might. I said, "I've thought on it." She waited. I said, "I'll come work the place through the winter, see how it sits. If it sits right, we can talk to a preacher in spring." She said, "That's reasonable." I said, "I'd need to know one thing." She said, "Ask it." I said, "The men who sent that letter, they sent it as a joke, because they thought I'd be humiliated by the idea of being matched to you. I want you to know that I know that, and I want you to know that's not how I came here." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind came around the corner of the house and moved the loose strand of hair at her temple. She said, "I figured that out when I saw you." I said, "How?" She said, "A man who comes out of embarrassment walks different from a man who comes because he chose to." Then she opened the door a little wider, which was all she was going to say about it, and I came in. The winter was hard. Winters out here always are, but this one had particular intentions. A hard freeze in November, then a thaw that rotted the ground into mud that swallowed fence posts whole, then a blizzard in January that put 3 feet on the level and a good deal more in the draws. I moved my things to the Frick place in December. Walt Frick watched me unload my saddle and my box and the bedroll and said nothing. He was a man running on will at that point, his body already making plans he didn't know about yet. But he watched the way a man watches who is calculating whether something is going to hold. I started on the north fence first because it was the worst. Edna, she told me to call her Edna on the second day, said Miss Frick made her feel like a schoolmarm, came out the first morning and worked the line beside me without asking whether I needed help. She drove posts. She strung wire. She had a way of setting her weight when she swung the maul that said she'd been doing it for years. We worked, we didn't talk much. After a while I noticed we didn't need to. There is a particular thing that happens between people who work hard in the same direction for long enough, a kind of vocabulary that isn't words, a hand gesture that means hold this, a pause that means look at that, a small sound that means good, that'll do. We built that vocabulary through November and December without noticing we were building it. I noticed it one morning in January when we were pulling a calf in the cold, the cow down, the calf half presented, both of them in trouble. And Edna was at the head talking the cow calm and I was doing the pulling, and she said something to me without words, just a look and a slight lean of her body. And I understood it perfectly and shifted my grip, and the calf came, and that was that. After, when we'd gotten the cow up and the calf nursing and both of them in the warmth of the barn, Edna sat on a hay bale and rubbed her hands together and said, "Not bad for a Monday." I laughed. It came out of me before I decided to do it, and it surprised both of us. She looked at me with something shifting in her pale blue eyes, not warmth exactly, not yet, something more careful than warmth. More honest. Walt Frick died in February. He'd been heading there since October and we both knew it, and when it came it was in the early morning, quiet, no drama. He was in his bed and he was there, and then he wasn't. Edna sat with him for a while after. I stayed in the kitchen and made coffee and kept the stove fed and didn't try to put words to anything. When she came out she sat across from me at the table and we drank coffee and she didn't cry, not in front of me, and I didn't expect her to. Her face was set and her eyes were red at the rims, and that was all. She said, "He knew you were going to be here. He didn't say it, but he knew." I said, "How do you figure?" She said, "He stopped asking me what I was going to do. He'd been asking me that for 3 years. When you came he stopped." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I refilled her cup. She said, "I'd like to talk to the preacher in the spring." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm telling you I've decided, not asking." I said, "I know that too." She almost smiled, not quite but almost. Spring came the way it does out here, slow and then sudden. One morning you wake up and the mud is drying and there are meadowlarks and the light has changed angle. We rode to town on a Tuesday. Preacher Aldous was a small, dry man who didn't ask many questions. He looked at Edna and then at me and said the words, and we said ours, and that was that. We ate a meal at the only restaurant in town, which was just 2 tables in the back of the general store, and Edna had coffee and I had coffee, and we looked at each other across the table for the first time as married people. She said, "I should tell you something." I said, "All right." She said, "When the letter came, the one those men sent, I almost didn't reply. I'd had similar things before, men making sport. I almost threw it in the fire." I said, "What made you write back?" She said I read it 3 times. She said there was something in it. She paused. She said it was that it wasn't cruel. The joke was meant to be mean, but the letter itself wasn't mean. She said the men who wrote it were mocking me, but they weren't mocking you. They were trying to mock you by matching you to me, but they couldn't make you sound like less than what you were, even when they were trying. She said, so I thought, whoever wrote this, even if he didn't mean to, he treated me like a person, and that was worth finding out about. I sat with that. I said, they called you the homeliest maid in the county. She said, I know what they called me. I said they were wrong. She looked at me across the 2 cups of coffee and the small table in the back of the general store. Her pale blue eyes, her square jaw, the red at her knuckles that never quite went away. She said, you don't have to say that. I said, I'm not saying it to be kind. I'm saying it because it's accurate. You are not a homely woman. You are a plain-spoken, capable, hard-working woman who has been misjudged by men who couldn't see past their own idea of what a woman's supposed to look like. And I'm tired of small men deciding what things are worth. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, quiet, that's the most you've ever said at once. I said I had a point to make. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just for a moment, and that was everything. The thing about Pete Rewell and Denny Cork and the men in the bunkhouse is that they heard about the marriage eventually. Word travels in cattle country. It travels faster when it's something that was supposed to be funny and didn't turn out to be. Rewell rode out in June. He came on the pretense of returning a bridle I'd left at Cartwright's, which he could have sent with anyone, which meant he was curious. He sat his horse at the gate and looked at the place, which was in considerably better shape than it had been in the fall, and then he looked at me standing in the yard, and then his eyes went past me to where Edna was in the kitchen garden staking tomatoes. He said, I'll be damned, Cord. I said, is that right? He said, we thought you'd be furious. I said, did you? He said, we were sure of it, the whole winter, we kept waiting. I said, and what would that have done for me? He chewed on that. He handed down the bridle. He said, well, I'll be damned again, which seemed to be all he had. I thanked him for the bridle and went back to work. I heard him riding out slow, looking back. I didn't turn around. There was nothing back there I needed to see. This is the thing I know now that I didn't know at 43, or knew but hadn't lived yet. A man can let other men decide what's worth wanting. He can take their word for what a good life looks like, what a woman's supposed to be, what's beneath him and what's above. He can let their jokes cut the shape of his world. Or he can ride out on a Sunday morning without telling anyone and find out for himself. I think about Rewell sometimes. He spent a whole winter waiting to feel superior to me, and he rode away with nothing but confusion and a long look at somebody else's good life. What I have is not easy. The land doesn't cooperate and the weather doesn't care, and there are mornings when everything is hard. But it's mine. The fence is tight and the roof holds, and in the evening when the light comes flat across the pasture, Edna sits on the porch steps with her coffee, and she doesn't need to say anything, and neither do I. Sometimes she'll look over at me and there will be something in her face, that careful, honest thing that isn't performance, and I know what it means. It means she sees me. Not what I could be or what I was or what she's hoping I'll become. Just what I am, which is a man who chose well and worked hard and got here. That's all it is, but it's considerable. The meadowlarks are in the south pasture again. The tomatoes Edna staked in June have gone tall. This morning she called to me from the porch before I got to the barn, and when I turned she just held up a cup, meaning coffee's hot. Don't be long. And I turned back and went to the barn because the stock doesn't wait. But I took the long way around the south side so I could hear the meadowlarks. That was this morning. And tonight I'll sit on that porch beside her, and the light will do what it does, and there won't be anything that needs saying. I expect that will go on for a while. I expect it will be enough.